Hey everybody, welcome back to the channel. Today I've got a little treat for you. I've got this beautiful 14 karat gold, solid gold cased watch. It's an Elgin 15 jewel. It's got a little issue with the mainspring, so we're going to take it apart and just do a light service on it. A friend brought this over to me the other day and wanted to know if I could fix it for him. So we're going to dismantle the watch and go through it. And while we're at it, I'm also going to talk about several other issues that I commonly find with old pocket watches and some of the issues that we have to cross to fix those. So let's get started with this. You can see right now I'm opening up the back of the case and I'm just kind of winding it here to see if it does anything. I can hear the spring slipping. You can't hear because I have the audio cut off on the camera, but spring slips every once in a while, which tells me that it's either A, broken, or B, it is not locked in place with the center pinion or the mainspring barrel. Well, you'll see that in a little bit. So some of the common issues that I find related to mainsprings with pocket watches are like this one. The watch actually will slip, and that indicates a broken spring or a dislodged spring or just something maybe bent out of place. We'll have to go in there and open it up and find out. Commonly, older watches that are not well maintained, the springs will break, especially if they sit for, 20, 30 years and you go to wind it. Spring's been sitting in one position all that time. You go to wind it, it's fatigued, and they'll sometimes crack and cause the watch not to run. You can usually tell this when you wind it with the crown. You'll either not hear any clicking at all, or you'll hear the clicking, but the spring and the crown feels really loose. It's an indication usually that the spring is broken. On this particular watch, you can see I've got two half case screws. We're going to loosen those up and remove the watch from the case and move on to the next stage, which for me is going to be taking the hands off of this watch. I don't want to do any damage to the hands on this particular watch while I'm working on it. And since I'm not going to do a full service on this watch, there's really no need to take off the dial. I just want to remove the hands and keep them safe and aside in the parts tray. So when it comes to mainsprings, there's a lot of things that we have to deal with. Dirty mainsprings. A lot of times you'll open up the mainspring barrel and the spring will be like seized up and greased. It was over greased at one time. The grease has since dried and it has caused that spring not to release freely. Most of the time, if you don't want to buy a new mainspring, you can get away with cleaning and polishing the spring to see if it'll hold in place and re-lubricate. Put it back in the barrel, and 8 out of 10 times it works fine. Once in a while, you get a spring that's just overly used, a watch that was well enjoyed, and the spring has worn down to a point where you just can't get it to run. So it's a good indication that it's time to change the mainspring. Here you can see I'm just putting a little pressure on the center wheel, trying to get that balance staff to turn. It does want to run. It's just unfortunately the spring is giving no power to the train, so we're going to go ahead and open the rest of this up. I'll start by removing the two case screws. Remember, these are half screws. So you just remove them from the back of the watch movement, put them aside someplace. We'll put those back when we're ready to case the watch back together. Other issues that I find with the mainsprings is that somebody has overwound a watch. And again, this relates to a dry or maybe a rusty or seized up mainspring, where you go to wind the watch and it just doesn't run when you fully wound the mainspring. That's an indication, again, that it's dirty. It needs to be cleaned. Again, 8 out of 10 times you can save the mainspring, but sometimes you just can't. You got to replace it. The cost of mainsprings over the last 10 years has gone up quite a bit, so keep that in mind for these antique American watches. Believe it or not, it's cheaper to buy mainsprings for a Rolex than it is to buy for a Waltham or an Elgin or a Howard watch. Here you can see we're opening up the watch, and I'm going to pull out the mainspring barrel. And there's some debris in this watch. It's not that bad. I'm going to go through and pull it out. But you can see the barrel itself has dried grease all over it, which is a good indication that that's one more reason that this watch just won't run. I'll pull off this gear here. That's the ratcheting gear for the mainspring. And we'll open up the barrel, and then we can get a good look at what's going on inside. Another common reason why old pocket watches won't run is because, again, they've been sitting around and maybe even the mainspring is clean and it's got enough grease in it, but the grease or oil that was used to lubricate the jewels in the watch and the pinions has seized up over time. Debris, dust, heat, humidity gets to a watch and kind of dries up all the debris. Here you can see this mainspring barrel and the pinion for the barrel. It's just full of dried grease. So we're going to go ahead and clean everything and get this all squared away. But movements get dust, dirt, debris. I find often lint, hair. You'd be surprised what I pull out of watches sometimes. That'll go in there and seize up a watch movement. And sometimes not necessarily that there's a broken part. It's just that there's just too much debris that is keeping the watch from running. Some of these gears that turn on the watch require very, very little pressure. So the slightest thing that gets in the way will stop the watch from working. Here you can see the mainspring I just pulled out. It is pretty greasy and dried up. That barrel is filthy. So we're going to go ahead and soak this in cleaning solution and then clean it for 15 minutes in the ultrasonic cleaners. Get that all cleaned up. Here you can see I've cleaned and polished the mainspring and it's ready to go back together. Mainspring is still in good shape. It just needs to be cleaned up a little bit. It's not perfect, but it's going to run this watch very, very well and just doesn't justify charging my customer, my friend, $60 to put a new mainspring in. You can see now the barrel is cleaned from all the debris that was on it. It has no more dried grease. All that green goo is gone and everything looks ready to go back together. So one of the other problems I find often is pocket watches will get dropped. Of course, they get dropped and they don't work, so somebody throws it in a drawer. And these antique watches, typically the main culprit after a drop is a balance jewel and a balance staff. There's usually 2 to 4 balance jewels on a watch, and the staff itself, when it takes a hit, it's very unforgiving. Not like modern wristwatches that have little spring clips that hold the jewels in place. Most antique pocket watches, anything made before 1950, those jewels are screwed in place and held with a lot of tension. And if the drop happens to occur just right, you'll crack a jewel, break a balance staff. A lot of times we'll change a balance staff and have to change the jewels too because it's just a casualty of a drop. Balance staffs are relatively easy to repair. Balance jewels for these old watches are becoming harder and harder to find. There are some companies that still make some that fit well. You're just going to have to go on a hunt to find it. And there you can see I was using my mainspring winder to wind in the mainspring, which is always a good idea. Using your hands can often cause problems with the grease or oil that you use for your mainspring. And the grease on your hands can actually cause damage to the mainspring. So it's always a good idea not to try to wind them by hand. I'm just giving this a little mainspring grease to run this watch. It's an older watch, older spring, and I'm using a little extra grease on there. Probably over-greased it by accident, but I'll clean it up and wipe it off before I put the cover back on. So now I'll put that barrel back in. That barrel is the winding arbor for the mainspring. That arbor actually has a little notch on it. It only goes in one way. As long as you put your mainspring in the correct way, that is only going to go in one way, and that's perfect. That you'll always know when the watch's spring is in there correctly. Also, good idea to take notes if you don't do this all the time and you're not sure. It's always a good idea. Take notes, take pictures. Everybody's got a camera on their phone these days. It's easy to do. So other than broken balance staffs and balance jewels, I'll often find pallet forks get damaged during a drop. Sometimes the balance staff is fine, the balance jewels are fine, but they'll dislodge a jewel on the pallet fork or the pinion on the pallet fork will break. And in those cases, we just replace the pinion. Sometimes the jewels, I have pallet jewels. You can get pallet jewels from any watch supplier, so you can change most of them. They're a little trickier because they have to be the right length and the right width to operate the watch correctly. Here you can see I put the barrel in there, and there's a little click spring. I notched that in so that it kind of hit that ratchet wheel underneath the mainspring barrel. And now I'm just putting the stem in, and I'm going to lube it up a little bit before we put the plate back on the watch. A lot of other times I get watches, especially hunter case watches, they may bang against something and they'll come in with a broken crystal. Hunter case watches use a very, very thin crystal, much thinner than you would imagine. And those crystals are very delicate, because they're hunter case watches, you have a metal cover covering the face of the watch. That usually protects them, but sometimes you crack it or it's not seated well in the bezel, and they'll just fall out or crack. It's a common issue, and I also find that with in the 1950s and 60s, people who were repairing pocket watches would typically change from glass to plastic, and plastic doesn't hold up very well. It either turns green or it fogs up or crazes. Crazing is the cracks that you see or the crackling in a plastic crystal, and that sometimes is just you can't fix it, you can't polish it out. So new crystals, I have stocks of old new stock, and you can still buy brand new pocket watch crystals on the market. They're always available. Just find a good supplier if you're looking for one. Here I'm just getting all the gears in position, putting that plate back together, and what I want to do is just tickle the gears very, very lightly, make sure they get seated in the pinion correctly, and of course this watch is jeweled, so you don't want to put much pressure on it. And what I'll do is I'll typically use a long, thin screwdriver, or I'll use an oiler to kind of get in there and just move the gear back and forth until everything snaps into place. And sometimes, if I have to, I'll work under a microscope just to make sure that I'm doing this correctly. And here I'm just kind of poking and prodding, just trying to move one of those gears. It's the second gear that is giving me a hard time and will go into place. I'll move to the microscope and get this done for you. So a lot of other times, if somebody puts a watch together and they do it incorrectly, or let's say they're trying to snap the plates back into place and they don't have the pinions lined up in the jewels, they'll actually chip or crack a plate jewel. Those are a little bit more egregious to change and a little bit harder to find. So you also have to look for those. That's another common issue that I'll see, especially a watch that wasn't well taken care of. So this particular watch was probably never used, judging by the condition of the case and the condition of the watch. There is some debris that I had to go in there and physically remove from the gears. Probably should have had a full service, but actually it's running and keeping time after this light service in the mainspring. So here you can see I've got the plate back in, all the gears are seated correctly, and I'm just going to tighten up those three plate screws to put that 3/4 bridge back on there tight. And I'm going to apply a little pressure to the main gear and just see if the mainspring or the balance staff wants to run. And it's a little bit on the weak side, a little weaker than it was before when I took it apart. So I'm going to go ahead and just remove the dial. I'm going to oil the whole movement, and I'm going to just clean up the balance and the hairspring a little bit, make sure that that's cleaned of debris, and I'll go back and retry this. So here you can see there's 3 dial feet or dial screws on this particular model. So we're going to loosen up those screws without removing them. I can pull the dial off, and then that gives me access to the upper side of the movement, and I can go ahead and just give each pinion a little bit of oil. Other issues I find with watches is that sometimes, and it's a little rare with pocket watches, sometimes the stems will wear out. Again, this is an issue where somebody hasn't taken care of the watch over years, and the stem will wear, or if there was a grinding issue with the watch that nobody had cleaned or serviced over the years that they own the watch, they may have worn down or rounded out the square ends of the stem itself, in which case then we have to go either on the hunt for a new one, or we all have to make a new stem, which is, for these antique pocket watches, it's cumbersome, can be done, but it's kind of not something I like doing. There still are quite a few common movements out there, so you can still find parts watches depending on what you need. Be careful with parts watches because they usually have the same problem that you have when you're trying to find a watch that has a good part in it and it happens to have the same broken part you have. Typically balance staffs, balances, pallet forks, those are the ones that you got to be on the lookout because you're trying to fix that or replace that part with something of the same caliber, and unfortunately you might buy a parts watch that just doesn't work. Here you can see I'm removing the complete balance out, and I'm going to just give it a little bit of light oil. There's not a lot of debris on these jewels, which is really good. Again, this watch I'm sure just kind of sat somebody's safe or a drawer somewhere and it never got used. It's very, very in very good condition. So I'm going to go ahead, oil the movement, oil the pallet, and we'll give it a little test when we wind it and make sure that the pallet fork kind of springs back and forth like it should. And we like to see that spring. I've given the mainspring a little bit of a wind so it puts some tension across the bridge and the train so that it's giving power to the whole watch. So some of the rare issues that I see with pocket watches, I don't see a lot of antique pocket watches come in that are water damaged. Most everybody knows these aren't, dive watches. You can't go swimming with it. You can't take a shower with it. It's just one of those things that, people know about. So when I see a watch that's been water damaged, I had one that came in from Hurricane Ian. I did a video on that not too long ago, so go back and take a look at that. But you'll find that either it's been stored in a basement and the parts have rusted, or it did get wet at one time, and instead of having it serviced, somebody just threw it in a box or a drawer, and that's where it ended up rotting away. Sometimes I'll see a watch, and this is very rarely, somebody will bring in a pocket watch, usually a hunter case pocket watch that's missing a bezel. It'll occasionally happen with open face watches, but mostly with hunter watches. For some reason, the bezels fall off or pop off, and they don't get put back on, and they get lost, thrown out, damaged, whatever. So if that's the case, there's nobody making new pocket watch cases anymore, not unless they're custom made and machined specifically for a watch, and that's rare. It's just one of those things. And with the price of gold going up, what's happened across the market is that most people will scrap gold-filled and solid gold cases, and then you have these movements that have no cases to go in, and you hope that you can find something to replace it. I'm a hoarder in that sense. I like to keep all the old cases, try to find matching parts when somebody comes in with a missing part on a watch case, but it's rare. There were so many manufacturers of watch cases over the last 200 years that, sadly, you almost never find a part that you're looking for a watch case. Bezels, once they're lost, pretty much the case is scrapped. It's just the way it is. And a lot of times if somebody comes to me with a case that's missing a cover or a bezel, I'll tell them just buy a new case. I'll find a case for you that's in good shape and we'll go from there. But it's just the way it is. We're not going to be able to find the part that's going to perfectly fit. So now you see I put the balance back in. The watch is running really good, which is nice. It's got a good solid twist to it. And I'm putting in those half screws for the case. Those are the case screws that hold the watch movement into the case. They are, split down almost the center. Only a third of the watch or the screw is missing. So that'll hold the watch in the case itself. You can see here as I turn that, the part of the screw is clamped onto the case, the case frame, and that holds the movement in position. I did get that a little out of position on the camera. I apologize for that, but you can see how that works. Well, the watch is pretty much back together. The only thing I've got to do now is just kind of wipe down any fingerprints or any marks on the watch. Again, this is a gold case, so we're just going to wipe it off with a polishing cloth. And I'm going to make sure that, these are lint-free polishing cloths, which are nice to have. You can get them on Amazon or eBay, and they work really well. Remove any fingerprints or oils, anything left on the watch movement here. So I'm putting on that second hand. I always start with the second hand or the hour hand, just to get myself acquainted with putting the hands in place with the system I use. You're going to gently push down on that hand to hold it into the third wheel pinion, and that's what rotates the second hand on these watches. Any debris or anything I'll blow off with a hand blower, and then we'll start with the hour hand. So I'm going to get that hour hand on the watch. I use a tool for hands. These are hand insert tools, and they allow you to push down gently and completely on the hand itself over the cannon pinion and the hour wheel, so you can get that placed perfectly without putting too much pressure. And forgive me, I cut my nails the other day, so I have no fingernails. I'm trying to get the lever out to set the time, and then I'm going to align the hour hand to a specific hour indicator so that I can put the minute hand and know that it's pointing, in this case, right at the 9, so that when I put the minute hand on, it's pointing at the 12, and we know it's 9 o'clock. I'm just going to tighten that hand down on the cannon pinion. Just make sure it's seated correctly. Once that's done, I've got the lever pulled out, so I can go ahead and set this watch. This is a stem wind lever set, and I'm just checking for tolerances and making sure the hands don't hit each other. That will stop the watch if those hands rub against each other. Once I'm happy with that, we'll push in that lever, and we'll work our way over to the bezel and put the bezel back on. You can see, well, actually, I'm wrong there. Let me forgive me for that mistake. I usually leave the lever out when I put the bezel on. The purpose of that is because that lever will slam against the bezel and keep it from ratcheting into the watch. Now, it doesn't happen with every watch. It just depends on certain types of cases and movements. You pull in that lever, and it'll fall underneath the bezel and becomes a nightmare to get out. So here's the watch in all its glory. It's in beautiful shape. I don't see a need to polish this up. It's in phenomenal shape. It's not my watch, not from my collection, so whoever owned this watch really took phenomenal care of it. And the spring for the opening, the Hunter case open spring, is perfect. That little case spring pops that lid open like it was brand new. And you can see it's running really good. I put this on the timer. It's plus or minus 10 seconds, which is not that bad, especially for a watch that's, from the late 1800s, and it's in good shape and ready to go back to the customer. I hope they appreciate it. Guys, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, give it a thumbs up. If you're not a subscriber, consider subscribing. And I've got a little thanks button there. You can donate me a little bit of money, buy a cup of coffee. I live on coffee. It's kind of the second thing I'm addicted to besides chocolate. So I appreciate you watching. Have a wonderful day, and be on the lookout. Oh, by the way, I'll be doing a video next on a beautiful French dusk clock. So be on the lookout for that. That'll be coming up in the next couple of weeks. Thanks, and have a great day.